"Keep quiet, we don't want old voices on the mic." Those words weren't shouted. They weren't announced over speakers. No, they were whispered, right into my ear, with a smile so sweet the guests around us thought my daughter-in-law was saying something kind. But I heard her, and I felt it. Her words didn't just cut through the music and the chatter, they cut through me. I stood there, pearl necklace resting just above the neckline of my modest pastel dress, my hands trembling slightly as I smoothed the fabric over my lap. My son was standing at the head table, looking radiant, proud, and blissfully unaware of what had just been said to his mother. I swallowed my voice. Not because I agreed, not because I was weak, but because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. My name is Lillian Hart. I'm 74 years old. I've spent most of my life in a classroom, teaching other people's children to believe in themselves, to speak up, to find their voices. And yet, that night at my son's wedding, I sat silent because my daughter-in-law had decided my voice wasn't worthy of being heard. Before I go any further, I want to pause. I want to know something from you. Yes, you, the one watching right now. Where are you watching from? Are you in your living room, maybe with a cup of tea in your hand? Or are you lying in bed, scrolling through stories that sound far too much like your own life? Tell me in the comments, because tonight I'm not just telling my story. I'm telling the story of so many mothers, grandmothers, and elders who've been told to step aside, to stay quiet, to become invisible. But let me take you back, long before the wedding day, before the whisper. You see, I wasn't always the woman sitting quietly at the corner table, holding my breath. I was once a young wife, a hopeful bride, much like the one who thought she owned the spotlight that night. I married my high school sweetheart Thomas when I was barely 20. He had the kind of laugh that filled a room and a way of looking at me that made me feel like I was the only person who mattered. We built a little home together, not much more than 2 bedrooms and a leaky roof, but it was ours. When our son, Michael, was born, the house suddenly seemed to glow brighter. Every corner was filled with the sound of his baby giggles, the thud of his little footsteps, the questions that only a curious child could ask. But just when life felt secure, when I thought the story was only beginning, tragedy struck. Thomas passed away unexpectedly when Michael was only 7. A heart attack, the doctors said. One moment, he was kissing me goodbye before leaving for work. The next, he was gone. I didn't just lose my husband that day. I lost the partner who shared the weight of raising a child, the friend who would have stood beside me at every milestone, including the wedding that now felt so hollow. But grief doesn't pay bills, and tears don't feed children. So I went back to teaching, full-time, and then some. Days in the classroom, evenings tutoring, weekends taking any extra work I could find. Every decision I made, every penny I saved was for my son, for Michael, for his future. I remember one winter when we couldn't afford heating. I wrapped myself in old coats, but I made sure he had a new blanket. I remember the nights I skipped dinner so he could have seconds. And I remember the promise I whispered into his sleeping ear. One day, son, you'll stand tall in this world, and I'll be right there, watching. That was the dream. That was what kept me going. So when he graduated from college, I clapped louder than anyone. When he got his first job, I baked a cake even though it was just the 2 of us eating it. And when he told me he had met someone, my heart swelled. Not with jealousy, not with fear, but with hope. Hope that he had found love, the kind I once had, the kind I lost too soon. Her name was Emily. She was beautiful, polished, confident. I could see why Michael was smitten. But from the very first moment we met, there was a wall. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She shook my hand, but her grip was limp, reluctant. I told myself it was nerves, that she just needed time. After all, love was about building bridges, wasn't it? But bridges don't hold if only one person is laying down the planks. That whisper at the wedding, the one that told me to keep quiet, Wasn't the first time Emily had tried to erase me. It was just the most public. And that night, as the music swelled and my silence sat heavy in my chest, I didn't yet know what was coming. I didn't know the entire room would soon learn a truth Emily couldn't control. But we'll get there. For now, you need to know this. I didn't raise my son through decades of sacrifice, loneliness, and hardship to be treated as an afterthought at the very moment I should have been honored. And though I stayed quiet that night, my silence wouldn't last forever. Raising Michael alone was not a choice. It was survival. After Thomas passed, I had no time to collapse, no luxury to break apart. I had a little boy looking up at me with wide, frightened eyes, asking questions I couldn't answer. "Where's Daddy?" he whispered one night, clutching his toy car in one hand and my sleeve in the other. I swallowed the lump in my throat and pulled him into my arms. "Daddy's in heaven, sweetheart, but I'm right here, and I'll always be right here." From then on, my life became a rhythm of sacrifice. Morning meant breakfast, packed lunches, and quick kisses before running to teach a classroom full of children. Afternoons blurred into evenings of grading papers, then tutoring other kids just so I could bring home extra money. Nights stretched long into silence. After Michael had fallen asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table, bills spread before me, calculating how to stretch pennies into dollars. There were winters when the draft in our old house made the air bite at our skin. I remember tucking Michael into bed with 2 pairs of socks on, pulling the thickest blanket I owned over him, and whispering lullabies through chattering teeth. I would sleep in layers of sweaters on the couch, my hands raw from washing dishes in icy water, but I never let him feel cold if I could help it. There were summers, too, sticky, relentless summers, when the fan barely kept us cool, and Michael would beg for ice cream. Some days I couldn't afford it. I'd make us frozen juice pops in cracked plastic trays, pretending it was just as good. He would grin, sticky juice dripping down his chin, and in those moments I swore I'd find a way to give him the world. My colleagues told me I was strong. My neighbors said I was admirable. But what no one saw were the nights I cried into my pillow, muffling sobs so Michael wouldn't hear. Strength is not the absence of fear or pain. It's the choice to keep moving through it. And Michael, my sweet boy, he gave me reason to keep moving. He was bright, curious, and stubborn in the best way. I still remember the first time he looked up at me after school, waving a spelling test with a big red A on top. "I did it, Mom!" he shouted, running into my arms. From that day forward, I made every celebration about him. Birthdays, even when money was tight, always had balloons. Holidays, even if we couldn't afford a tree, had songs and laughter. I wanted him to feel rich in love, even if our bank account was poor in dollars. And through all of it, I whispered to him the same promise I had whispered that first night after Thomas died. "I will always be here for you." But as he grew older, as boys do, the closeness began to stretch. He wanted independence, wanted to stay after school with friends, wanted to play sports that I could barely afford the uniforms for. Still, I found ways. I hemmed old clothes, sold baked goods at church fundraisers, and skipped hair appointments so he could join the soccer team. By high school, he towered over me, broad-shouldered, confident, carrying the kind of potential I had worked my whole life to nurture. And when he crossed the graduation stage, cap tilted on his head, diploma in hand, I cried so hard the people around me probably thought I'd lost my mind. But they didn't know. They didn't know what it meant to sit in that auditorium and see every sacrifice materialize into a moment of triumph. He wasn't just graduating from school. He was graduating from the years of struggle, from the nights I had gone hungry, from the prayers whispered over unpaid bills. I clapped until my palms stung, and when he looked out into the audience and found me, he grinned. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, every ounce of love and sacrifice had been worth it. College came next, a dream I thought might be out of reach, but I found a way. Scholarships helped, yes, but so did my extra tutoring sessions, the ones that left my back aching and my eyes bloodshot. I funneled every spare dollar into his future, telling myself, if he can have what I never had, then it's worth it. And when he graduated from college, oh, that day. I wore my best dress, the same pearl necklace I would wear years later at his wedding. I stood in the crowd, clapping, crying, whispering to Thomas in my heart, "We did it. Our boy made it." Michael hugged me so tight that day. He whispered in my ear, "Thank you, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." If I close my eyes, I can still feel the weight of that hug. That was the boy I raised. That was the son who once held my hand so tightly, who promised to look after me when I grew old. But promises, as I would come to learn, are fragile things. Sometimes they fade, not with malice, but with distance. Other times, they're drowned out by new voices, voices that don't want old ones to be heard. And little by little, as he stepped into adulthood, another voice began to echo louder in his life. The voice of the woman who would one day lean in and whisper to me at his wedding. I still remember the first time Michael brought Emily home. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sky looks bruised and the air carries the scent of wet earth. Michael walked in, taller than I remembered, standing beside a young woman with perfect posture and a smile that seemed rehearsed. "Mom, this is Emily," he said, his voice tinged with pride, as though he'd just introduced me to royalty. I reached out my hand, warmth in my eyes. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Emily. Michael's told me so much." Her hand met mine, cool and delicate, her grip barely there. "Likewise, Mrs. Hart," she replied, her tone polite but distant. Her eyes flicked over the modest little living room I'd kept tidy for decades, and for a moment I felt as if she were taking inventory, judging. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, first meetings are awkward. Maybe she was nervous. Maybe she just needed time. I brewed tea, set out the cookies I had baked that morning, and tried to make her feel welcome. She sipped politely, nodding at my questions, but her gaze always seemed to drift back to Michael, as though I were nothing more than a background character in their story. When she left that evening, Michael hugged me tightly. "Isn't she great, Mom?" he asked, his eyes alight with hope. And what could I say? That I had felt like a ghost in my own home? That the girl who might one day be my daughter-in-law hadn't once looked at me with genuine warmth? I smiled, kissed his cheek, and said the only thing a mother could say, "If she makes you happy, then I'm happy too." But deep down, unease stirred. Over the months that followed, I saw more of Emily. Dinners, birthday celebrations, little visits here and there. She was always polished, hair perfectly styled, nails manicured, clothes that seemed plucked from a fashion magazine. And yet, behind the perfect exterior, there was something sharp, something calculating. Once, when I offered to bring a dish to a family gathering, she smiled thinly and said, "Oh, don't worry, we've got the food covered. I wouldn't want you to stress yourself over complicated recipes." I laughed softly, trying not to let the sting show. I had spent decades perfecting my cooking, feeding not just my son, but half the neighborhood's children. But in her eyes, I was outdated, a relic. Another time, during wedding planning talks, I suggested a local florist I had known for years. Emily's response was quick, almost dismissive. "That's sweet, but we've decided on something more modern. We don't want it to look old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. That word began to hang between us like smoke. She never said it outright to insult me, but it was always there, in her tone, her glances, her careful exclusion of me from the details that mattered most. Michael, caught in the middle, seemed oblivious. He'd beam with pride when Emily spoke, nodding at her ideas, praising her taste. And every time, I bit my tongue, reminding myself that my son's happiness mattered more than my feelings. But the exclusions grew sharper. When talk turned to wedding seating, I noticed my place had been shifted farther from the head table. When family photos were planned, Emily's family was given center stage, while I was nudged toward the edge of the frame. One evening, I overheard her laughing with a friend on the phone. "Don't worry, I'll handle it. His mom's sweet, but she doesn't really didn't fit." I sat on the couch that night staring at the pearls Thomas had given me on our 10th anniversary. I clutched them in my palm as though their smooth, familiar weight could remind me who I was. I wasn't a woman who needed to fit into someone else's mold. I had built my life out of scraps and prayers. I had raised a man out of a boy, and yet somehow, in Emily's world, none of that counted. Still, I stayed silent. I told myself she was young, that she didn't yet understand what family meant, that time, patience, and love would soften the edges between us. But time did not soften Emily. It sharpened her. By the time the wedding preparations were in full swing, my role had been whittled down to almost nothing. Invitations were chosen without me, music decided, colors selected. When I tried to offer input, Emily's response was always the same, a thin smile followed by some version of, "Oh, that's not really necessary." And so, I retreated. I bought my own dress quietly, a soft pastel shade that felt dignified. I polished my pearl necklace, determined to wear it with pride no matter how invisible they made me feel. What I didn't know then was that Emily's whispers and sidelong glances would soon turn into something far more cutting. And that, on the very night, she told me to keep quiet. Her own voice would falter in front of an entire room. Weddings in my day were family affairs. Everyone had a hand in them. Mothers, aunts, neighbors bringing casseroles, friends arranging flowers in church basements. It wasn't about money or grandeur. It was about love stitched into every detail. But Michael and Emily's wedding, it felt more like a production, a stage show where I wasn't even cast as a supporting character. I was barely an extra. At first, I tried. I really did. I offered to help with invitations. Emily smiled sweetly, that same rehearsed smile, and said, "Oh, don't trouble yourself, Mrs. Hart. We've already taken care of them." I asked about flowers. "We've got a designer," she said, waving her manicured hand as if my suggestion of the local florist was quaint, even laughable. Even the cake, something I had dreamed of contributing to, was dismissed. "We're going with a specialty bakery," Emily said. "It'll look better in photos." Each time her words were wrapped in politeness, but the message was clear. You're not needed here. I felt it most when seating arrangements came up. I had imagined sitting close, near the head table, watching my son and his bride, up close, as they celebrated the beginning of their lives together. Instead, my name was tucked away 3 tables back, not in the corner, but close enough to feel like a guest rather than the mother of the groom. When I mentioned it, Emily tilted her head, her voice laced with sugar. "We just thought it would be better for you to sit with some of the older guests. You'll be more comfortable." Older guests. The words settled over me like a shroud. I wasn't their family. I was just another old face to be managed, placed somewhere out of the spotlight. Michael, bless him, didn't seem to notice. Whenever I tried to bring it up, he'd squeeze my hand and say, "Mom, it's just details. The important thing is, I'm marrying Emily. Don't stress about where you're sitting or what cake they choose." But it wasn't about cake or chairs. It was about being erased from the very celebration I had spent my life preparing for. There was one moment that cut especially deep. The photographer had come by for a trial shoot, capturing shots of the couple and their families. When I stepped forward, ready to join, Emily put a hand lightly on my arm. "We'll do a few just with the immediate family first," she said, then guided her parents into the frame. Immediate family. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, watching as they smiled and laughed in front of the lens, their arms linked with my son's. I waited for Michael to call me over. He didn't. Not because he didn't love me, I told myself, but because Emily had a way of making her will seem like law. Later that evening, I sat at home polishing my pearl necklace, the one Thomas had given me on our 10th anniversary. I whispered to his photo, "You should be here. You should be the one standing beside him, making sure I'm not left out." But of course, Thomas wasn't there. It was just me. In the weeks before the wedding, I noticed small humiliations stacking like bricks. When I asked what I should wear, Emily said, "Something simple, so you don't clash with the bridesmaids." When I offered to help host some out-of-town relatives, she said, "We've already booked a hotel block. It'll be easier if they stay there." Even the rehearsal dinner, an event I had always assumed would be under the groom's family's care, was organized entirely by Emily's parents. I sat through it quietly, smiling at the right moments, applauding the speeches, sipping water while others toasted with wine. Not once was I acknowledged beyond the polite nod of Michael's mom. I felt invisible. But invisibility has its strange advantages. When people think you don't matter, they stop watching you. And when they stop watching, they forget you're listening. I heard more than Emily realized. Little comments she made to her bridesmaids. "We don't want her trying to give a speech. She'll ramble." Or to the wedding planner, "Make sure the spotlight is on my parents. They're the real hosts." The real hosts. That was when I understood. Emily and her family wanted the wedding to be their show. I wasn't just being pushed aside, I was being erased. And yet, I held my tongue. Not because I was weak, but because I knew something Emily didn't. When the wedding bills had mounted, when Emily's parents had faltered under the weight of the expenses, it had been me who quietly stepped in. Me who had written the check that covered the final installment, ensuring the band, the flowers, the hall, all of it would happen. I hadn't told a soul, not even Michael. It wasn't about recognition. It was about making sure his day was perfect. But perfect has a way of unraveling when truth enters the room. And on the night of the wedding, when Emily whispered for me to keep quiet, she had no idea that my silence would not remain hers to control. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I had in years. My pastel dress, soft and modest, hugged my shoulders neatly. The pearl necklace rested against my collarbone, its familiar weight reminding me of Thomas. Steady, constant, timeless. My silver hair was neatly pinned, a touch of powder brushed across my cheeks. I wanted to look like the woman I had always been, dignified, graceful, someone my son could be proud of. As I left the house, I whispered to the framed photo of Thomas on the mantel, "You should be here today, our boy's wedding. I'll sit for the both of us." The drive to the venue was quiet, my heart heavy but hopeful. I told myself I would not let Emily's dismissals spoil this day. This was about Michael, about the boy I had raised into a man. The hall itself was breathtaking. Crystal. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, white roses bloomed in polished vases, and candles flickered in tall glass cylinders along the aisles. Guests mingled in suits and gowns, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Everything gleamed with the sheen of money and modernity, so different from the small church wedding I'd once dreamed of for my son. As I entered, heads turned politely. Some smiled, recognizing me as the groom's mother. A few even remarked, "You must be so proud." And I was. Proud beyond words, but beneath their smiles I noticed how easily I was ushered toward the back, as though pride had its limits when wrapped in old age. An usher handed me a program. I scanned the pages quickly, and my eyes landed on the line that made my stomach twist. Parents of the bride, Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield. Then, in smaller letters beneath the groomsmen and bridesmaids, mother of the groom, Mrs. Lillian Hart. One name. Alone. No mention of Thomas. No acknowledgement of the years I had spent holding Michael's world together. Just a footnote at the bottom of the page. I found my table, 3 rows back as Emily had planned. It was decorated beautifully, but it felt removed, distant from the heart of the celebration. As I sat down, I smoothed my dress again, forcing my lips into a polite smile. Around me, other older relatives adjusted their glasses and murmured quietly. I was one of them now. Not central, not essential, but placed neatly where we wouldn't interfere. From my seat, I could see the head table being prepared. White linens, gleaming silverware, glasses lined like crystal soldiers. Emily's parents bustled around, greeting guests with wide smiles, their pride swelling like peacocks. Michael stood with them, handsome in his suit, his face glowing with happiness. For a moment, the sight of him stole my breath. That was my boy, my Michael. The little boy I had tucked under blankets in winter, the young man I had cheered for at graduations. He looked so confident, so ready. My heart swelled. And yet, as he leaned close to Emily's parents, laughing with them, I felt a pang. They stood at his side, front and center, while I sat 3 tables back. During the ceremony, I held my breath as the music swelled and Emily walked down the aisle. She was radiant, yes, but her eyes never flickered toward me. When she reached Michael, his face lit up in a way that made my throat ache. He loved her, truly loved her. The vows were beautiful, words of forever, of promises and dreams. Guests dabbed their eyes with tissues. I clasped my hands, praying silently that her heart would one day soften toward me, that my son's marriage would not always feel like a wall built higher with every brick of her pride. But even in that moment of beauty, small cuts found their way in. When the photographer called for family photos after the ceremony, I stepped forward instinctively. Emily, with her polished smile, gently touched my arm. "We'll get you in. Later, Mrs. Hart. Just the immediate family first." Just the immediate family. I froze, my feet rooted to the ground, while Emily's parents slipped into the frame on either side of Michael. Flash after flash captured their smiles. I stood nearby, waiting. Eventually, they did call me in, but by then the energy had shifted. The photographer hurried me into the corner, snapping 2 quick shots before moving on. Invisible. That's how I felt. Like a shadow in the corner of a day I had bled and sacrificed for. Back at my table during the reception, I tried to lift my spirits. Guests clinked glasses, laughter rang out, the music started. I watched as Emily's parents stood proudly for the toasts, thanked for their incredible generosity and hard work. My hands folded tightly in my lap, I sipped from my glass of water. No one mentioned the check I had written quietly, the money I had poured into ensuring the band played that night, the food was served, the flowers filled the room. My contribution was invisible, just like me. And still I told myself, stay quiet, this is Michael's day. Smile, even if your heart feels heavy. But silence, I would learn, can only stretch so far before truth snaps through it. And that moment was coming. The ceremony began with music so soft it felt like a heartbeat beneath the chandeliers. Guests rose to their feet, and the air hummed with anticipation. My hands gripped the edge of the pew as Emily appeared at the back of the aisle, framed by roses and candlelight. I'll admit it, she looked stunning. The gown was fitted with delicate lace, her veil floating like mist behind her, the kind of beauty you see in magazines. The crowd gasped, phones raised like an ocean of glowing eyes, capturing every step she took toward my son. Michael's face, when he saw her, was pure light. His smile widened, his eyes softened, and for a moment, I forgot all the sharp words and exclusions. For a moment, I saw only the boy I had raised, now a man, in love, beginning his life anew. They stood together at the altar, hands joined, voices trembling with vows. Emily promised loyalty and partnership. Michael promised love and protection. Guests dabbed their eyes, sniffles echoing through the room. I blinked against my own tears, clutching the pearls at my throat. But as they slipped rings onto each other's fingers, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. The beauty of their words clashed with the silence around me. The way Emily's eyes never once flickered my way, the way her family beamed as though this moment belonged only to them. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, The room erupted into applause. I clapped too, my palms stinging with force. But even in that joy, I felt absent, like a spectator at a play, applauding actors in a story I had no part in. After the kiss, after the walk back down the aisle, came the chaos of photographs. I followed the crowd to the courtyard, where the photographer barked cheerful directions. Bride's family first, groom's family next. Big smiles, everyone. I stood waiting, heart swelling with expectation. This was the moment, I thought. The moment I would stand beside my son, captured forever in the photos that would hang on their walls, in albums, in frames, on mantels, proof that I had been there. But as I stepped forward, Emily intercepted me with that same thin smile. Her hand brushed my arm, light but firm. "We'll get you in later, Mrs. Hart. Just immediate family first." Her parents glided into place, linking arms with Michael as though they had raised him themselves. The camera flashed, and flashed again. Guests clapped, watching the perfect picture unfold. I stood there, frozen. My son didn't call me forward. Maybe he thought it was easier that way. Maybe he didn't notice. But with every click of the shutter, I felt myself erased, edited out of my own son's life. Finally, after what felt like forever, the photographer waved me over. "Mother of the groom," he said cheerfully, almost as an afterthought. I slipped into the edge of the frame, smiled quickly, and heard the hollow snap of 2 quick pictures before I was ushered aside again. That was it. My place in the official story. A blurred corner in someone else's portrait. Back inside, I sat quietly at my table, replaying the moment over and over. My hands shook slightly as I lifted my glass of water. Around me, guests chatted about the ceremony, about Emily's gown, about the splendor of it all. No one noticed the silence in my seat. Dinner was served. Plates of salmon, roasted vegetables, buttery rolls. The wine flowed freely at other tables, laughter rising with every refill. At mine, I nibbled politely, the taste of food lost against the bitterness in my throat. I reminded myself, this is Michael's day. Don't make it about you. But then came the speeches. Emily's father rose first, his booming voice filling the hall. He thanked guests for coming, praised his daughter's beauty, and toasted to the future. He ended with a flourish. To the new Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield Hart. Glasses clinked, cheers rose. Next, Emily's mother spoke, her words dripping with pride. She talked about raising Emily, about the values she instilled, about how grateful she was for this perfect day. Another round of applause. I waited for Michael to look my way, waited for someone to say, "Now, let's hear from the groom's mother." But no one did. The microphone passed from bridesmaids to groomsmen, from Emily's family to old college friends. I sat there, hands folded, my heart pounding. I had words prepared. Not a speech, but just a few simple lines of love and blessing from my son. Words I had held close for years. And then, as I shifted slightly, preparing to rise, Emily leaned down. Her lips brushed my ear, her smile painted perfectly for the crowd. "Keep quiet," she whispered. "We don't want old voices on the mic." Her tone was sugar, but the venom was unmistakable. My breath caught. My throat tightened, and for the second time that day, I swallowed silence. The room erupted in laughter as the best man told a joke. Glasses clinked again. No one saw the way my eyes burned. I sat back down, pressing my hands against my lap to stop them from shaking. And in that moment, I thought, if truth has its own way of speaking, then one day, they'll hear mine. Keep quiet. We don't want old voices on the mic. Those words rang in my ears long after Emily had turned her perfect smile back to the guests, as though nothing had happened. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't move. I didn't rise. I didn't reach for the microphone. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap, pressing my fingers tightly against the fabric of my pastel dress until the pearls at my neck seemed to weigh me down. My throat ached with words unsaid. Blessings I had planned, stories I had carried for decades, love I had intended to pour into that moment, all silenced in a single breath by the woman who had married into my family. Around me, laughter carried through the hall. Glasses clinked. The band tuned their instruments softly in the corner. To anyone watching, I was just another guest politely listening. But inside, I was unraveling. I tried to focus on Michael, my son. He laughed with his friends, his arm resting casually around Emily's chair, joy radiating from his face. He didn't know. He didn't hear the whisper. To him, I was still his mother, somewhere in the crowd, smiling and proud. And I wanted to preserve that illusion for him. I didn't want to shatter his happiness with the weight of my hurt. So I stayed silent, convincing myself I could swallow the pain, just as I had swallowed countless sacrifices before. But silence, I've learned, has a taste. It's bitter. It burns at the edges of your tongue, settling in your chest like lead, and the longer you hold it, the heavier it grows. As the speeches carried on, I stared at my glass of water, the light catching its surface like shards of glass. I thought of all the moments I had spoken when no one wanted to listen. The nights I had whispered promises to a sleeping child, the afternoons I had defended him at school, the times I had fought for him when money, circumstance, and loneliness threatened to take everything from us. My voice had carried him through life, and now, at his wedding, that same voice was deemed unworthy. A cousin leaned over at one point, smiling kindly. "Lillian, won't you say a few words later? I bet Michael would love that." I opened my mouth, but Emily's whisper echoed again in my head, slicing through the air like a blade. "Keep quiet." So I smiled weakly and shook my head. "Oh, I think the younger ones have it covered," I said softly. Inside, my heart cracked. The band began to play lightly between speeches. Filling the air with music meant to smooth over the pauses. Guests swayed in their seats, tapping their feet. The atmosphere buzzed with celebration, but for me, the sounds blurred together, a distant hum against the roar of my own silence. I looked down at my pearls, running my fingers along their smooth surface. Thomas had clasped them around my neck so many years ago, whispering, "For all the times you'll stand with me in public, looking elegant and strong." And here I was, standing alone, told to be silent, while others basked in the glow of a celebration I had quietly made possible. Because the truth, the one no one in that room knew, was that without me, this wedding might not have even happened. Emily's parents had faltered. Their pride had been bigger than their pockets. The bills, the band, the flowers, the final venue payment had exceeded what they could manage. I had seen the panic in Michael's eyes when he came to visit weeks before, torn between love for his fiancée and the financial storm brewing around them. I had written the check, quietly, privately, without asking for thanks. I had told myself it was for him, for his joy, that it didn't matter if my name wasn't spoken, if my place wasn't central. But sitting there, silenced, erased, I realized the cruel irony. I had paid for the very stage on which I was being told to disappear. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. The toasts ended. Guests clapped, laughter rippled, and the band leader stepped up to the microphone, preparing to launch into the evening's music. His voice boomed cheerfully. "Before we begin tonight's celebration, I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor who made tonight possible." My breath caught. The room quieted, glasses paused mid-air, faces turned expectantly toward the head table. Emily's parents straightened in their chairs, smiles already spreading, their hands clasped in anticipation of the praise about to be heaped upon them. I froze, pearls cool against my skin, my heart thudding so loudly I could barely hear the music anymore, and then the band leader spoke a name. Not theirs, mine. "On behalf of the band and this entire celebration," he said, smiling warmly, We would like to thank Mrs. Lillian Hart for sponsoring tonight's event." The room fell silent. Forks stopped mid-air. Heads turned, first in confusion, then in recognition, until every eye in the hall was on me. I sat there stunned, hands trembling lightly against my lap. Emily's smile faltered. Her parents' faces froze, color draining from their cheeks. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief, his gaze swinging toward me as though seeing me clearly for the first time that night. And in that silence, my voice, though unspoken, was louder than any speech I could have given. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The chandeliers above seemed to glow brighter in the silence, the clink of a fork somewhere in the back echoing louder than it should have. Every pair of eyes in that hall turned to me, some wide with surprise, others narrowing with curiosity. I sat there, still, my hands resting gently on my lap, fingers grazing the pearls at my throat. I hadn't asked for this moment. I hadn't wanted my name spoken aloud. And yet, here it was, truth spilling into the open, shattering the illusion Emily and her family had so carefully built. The band leader smiled warmly, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. Mrs. Hart's generosity ensured that tonight's music and celebration could be everything the bride and groom deserved. His words carried clearly, amplified by the speakers. A murmur swept across the room. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering behind raised hands. It was her? I thought her parents paid for this. Why didn't anyone say anything? At the head table, Emily's parents stiffened. Her father's forced smile faltered, his knuckles tightening around his glass. Her mother's cheeks flushed red, the color rising all the way to her ears. They had expected applause, admiration, the spotlight shining solely on them. Instead, the glow had shifted, brilliant and undeniable, onto me. Emily's face was a mask cracking at the edges. Her lips, still frozen in that perfect hostess smile, twitched slightly. Her eyes darted toward Michael, then toward me, panic flickering there before she schooled it into something resembling composure. And Michael, my son, looked stunned. His jaw slackened, his eyes searching mine from across the hall. I watched realization dawn on him, slow and heavy. He hadn't known, he hadn't suspected. And now, in front of everyone, he saw what I had done. I didn't move. I didn't smile or wave. I simply inclined my head slightly, a small nod, as though acknowledging a truth too heavy for words. The applause came hesitantly at first. A few scattered claps from the back, then more, until the hall filled with polite but uncertain applause. It wasn't the raucous cheering Emily's parents had hoped for. It was softer, tinged with curiosity, perhaps even respect. I could feel Emily's fury radiating across the room, though her smile never slipped entirely. She leaned close to Michael, whispering something sharp into his ear. He didn't respond. His eyes stayed on me. Guests began to look between the head table and my seat, confusion settling like a fog. Some looked at me with admiration, others with pity. I could almost hear their thoughts. Why wasn't she honored earlier? Why didn't anyone say anything? The band leader, sensing the tension but pressing on, strummed the first notes on his guitar. "All right, folks, let's celebrate this beautiful couple." His voice tried to reignite the party, but the air had shifted. At my table, a cousin leaned closer, whispering, "Lillian, why didn't you tell us?" I smiled faintly, because it wasn't about me. But now, it was. Across the hall, Emily's father raised his glass in a half-hearted attempt to redirect attention. "Well," he said loudly, forcing a chuckle, "we're all grateful for every contribution that made this night possible." His voice was strained, his pride bruised. But the band leader, bless him, wasn't done. "Yes, but we want to especially recognize Mrs. Hart. Without her support, this celebration might not have happened as it has. So thank you, ma'am." He gave a small bow in my direction. Emily's mother shifted uncomfortably, dabbing at her temple with a napkin. Emily herself clutched her glass tighter, her knuckles whitening. She managed to laugh softly, but it was brittle, breaking at the edges. Michael rose slightly from his chair, as though intending to come toward me, but Emily tugged at his sleeve, anchoring him back. Their whispered argument was too quiet for others to hear, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking back toward me. The music started. Couples moved toward the dance floor, but the hum of whispers never fully faded. Guests glanced at me with curiosity, nodding politely, some even with newfound respect. I hadn't spoken a word, and yet somehow my silence had become the loudest voice in the room. For the first time that evening, I didn't feel invisible. I hadn't planned for this moment of truth to be exposed in such a way, but as I sat there, quiet, steady, with every gaze turned toward me, I realized something important. I didn't need the microphone. I didn't need a toast. The truth had found its own way into the light. And for Emily, whose greatest weapon against me had been control of the narrative, control of appearances, control of the spotlight, that truth was devastating. Because in one moment the room saw her not as the flawless bride at the center of everything, but as a woman whose in-laws' pride had been misplaced. And it was only the beginning. The music played, but it couldn't drown out the whispers. Everywhere I looked, guests leaned closer to one another, eyes darting toward me, voices low but urgent. The revelation had shifted the room. A wedding that had once seemed perfectly polished now buzzed with a current of unease, like static beneath the surface. I sat perfectly still, sipping my water, my face calm though my heart was still racing. I didn't need to say a word. The truth had already spoken for me. At the head table, Emily's parents wore smiles that strained like cracked porcelain. Her father raised his glass every few minutes, as though another toast might patch the cracks in their pride. Her mother fussed with her napkin, eyes darting toward me, then away, unable to hold my gaze. And Emily, oh Emily, she was a vision in lace and pearls, but the mask she wore was slipping. Her smile remained, but her jaw tightened with every murmur she overheard. She whispered furiously to Michael, her hand gripping his arm so tightly I could see the indentation of her nails. Michael, for his part, looked conflicted. His eyes kept wandering toward me, confusion flickering in them, mixed with something else. Guilt, perhaps, or realization. He hadn't known. He hadn't asked. He had accepted the version of events Emily and her family had fed him, never thinking to question who had truly carried the weight of his wedding. Now, in front of everyone, that truth was undeniable. A few guests began to approach me, tentative but warm. An older woman from my church leaned down with a smile. "Lillian, why didn't you tell anyone? We'd have celebrated you properly." I patted her hand gently. "Because it was never about me." She squeezed my shoulder, eyes soft with understanding, before slipping back into the crowd. But I noticed how others began to follow her lead, nodding at me as they passed, offering small smiles of respect. Emily noticed too. Each nod, each glance in my direction, seemed to chip away at the carefully crafted image she had built. She wanted her parents to be the stars of this wedding, the benefactors, the centerpieces. Instead, she was forced to share the stage with the one person she had worked so hard to silence, and she hated it. The tension at the head table grew thicker. I saw Emily's father lean in toward Michael, whispering something with a forced chuckle, as though trying to spin the narrative. Michael shook his head slightly, his eyes still fixed on me. The first dance began soon after. Michael took Emily's hand, leading her to the center of the floor. The crowd circled, watching, phones lifted to capture the moment. They swayed together, her veil catching the light, his hand firm at her back. It should have been beautiful. It was, in a way. But the murmurs didn't stop. People still whispered about me, about the band leader's announcement, about how the mother of the groom had been overlooked. Emily's smile wavered, just enough for me to see it. Her jaw clenched as she leaned up to whisper something into Michael's ear. He didn't laugh. He didn't nod. He just kept glancing past her shoulder, toward me. When the song ended and applause rippled through the hall, Michael excused himself from Emily's side. For the first time that evening, he walked across the room, weaving through tables until he reached mine. "Mom," he said softly, leaning close. "Is it true?" I looked up at him, my eyes steady. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked just slightly, barely audible over the music. "Because it was for you," I replied. "Not for recognition, not for applause, just for you." His eyes glistened, and for a moment I saw the boy I had raised, the boy who once hugged me with all his strength at his high school graduation. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emily appeared suddenly, her hand clutching his arm. "Michael," she said, her smile painted on for the nearby guests, "they're waiting for us." He hesitated, torn between us. I saw the conflict flicker in his eyes, but in the end, he allowed himself to be led back to the head table. The storm wasn't over. It had only begun. As the evening continued, the whispers grew louder, less restrained. I caught fragments as guests passed by. Why wasn't she honored? Did they really hide that from everyone? Poor woman sitting back there while her money paid for the night. Emily's mask hardened with every passing comment. Her parents tried to laugh louder, toast more often, but the air had shifted. The perfection of the evening was gone, replaced by something raw and unsettled. And me? I sat quietly, my hands folded, my pearls cool against my skin. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to raise my voice, because sometimes the loudest sound in a room is the silence of someone who finally refuses to be erased. And I knew then, though Emily had silenced me at the microphone, she had lost something far greater, the control she prized above all else. The night carried on, but the air was heavy, thick with tension. The laughter no longer sounded natural. It rang too loud, too forced. Every clink of a glass seemed to echo over the whispers still circling the room. Emily's parents tried valiantly to reclaim the spotlight. Her father stood once more, his booming voice cutting through the hall. "Let's all raise a glass again for this wonderful evening," he said, chuckling too heartily, his eyes darting toward me like daggers. "A night that shows the beauty of family and love, and the combined efforts of so many people to make it possible." Combined efforts. A clever phrase meant to fold me into the shadows and return his family to center stage. Guests clapped politely, but the applause lacked conviction. The earlier announcement lingered too fresh in their minds. Emily, seated beside Michael, leaned forward suddenly, her voice bright but brittle. "Of course, we're grateful for everyone who helped," she said, her smile wide enough to hurt. "My parents, who've given so much, and Mrs. Hart, who made a contribution as well." Her words landed like stones in water, heavy, sinking, sending ripples of unease. A contribution. She was trying to reduce what had been revealed into something small, insignificant. But before the murmurs could spread further, the band leader, standing off to the side with his microphone still in hand, spoke again. His voice was kind but firm, carrying clearly across the room. "With all respect," he said, "this evening's final balance, the venue, the music, the arrangements, was fully covered by Mrs. Hart. Without her, none of us would be here enjoying this beautiful night." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's face froze, her smile cracking just enough to reveal the fury burning underneath. Her parents shifted uncomfortably, their pride collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth. All eyes turned to me, again. Dozens of faces, some surprised, some admiring, some quietly ashamed on my behalf. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. I simply lifted my chin slightly, meeting their gazes with calm dignity. Emily tried to laugh, a sharp sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, we're all family now," she said, the edge in her voice barely disguised. "It doesn't really matter who paid for what. Tonight is about love." But the guests weren't fooled. I could see it in the way they looked at her, no longer with awe, but with questions, with judgment. Michael shifted uncomfortably beside her, his hand tightening around his glass. He looked at me again, and this time, his eyes held something different. Guilt, yes, but also shame. And that was when I spoke. Not loudly, not with anger, just with the quiet, steady voice of someone who had carried too much for too long. I stayed quiet tonight, I said, my words carrying enough for those nearest to hear, and soon the rest of the room hushed itself to listen. Because that's what was asked of me. But truth has its own way of speaking. The room froze. No one clapped. No one laughed. They simply sat in the stillness, the weight of my words settling over them like a veil. Emily's face flushed crimson. Her jaw tightened, her eyes flashing as though she might retort, but no words came. Because what could she say? The truth stood naked in the room, undeniable. Michael lowered his gaze, shame flooding his features. He rubbed his forehead as though the weight of realization pressed too heavily against him. The guests shifted, uncomfortable in their seats. Some nodded quietly. Others stared down into their glasses, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The band leader, sensing the storm had peaked, gently strummed his guitar and changed the subject. And with that, let's bring everyone back to the dance floor. The spell broke. People rising hesitantly, eager to move past the moment but unable to erase it. I remained at my table, calm, composed, sipping my water. My silence was no longer invisibility, it was strength. And for the first time that night, I felt Thomas beside me, not in body but in spirit, his steady hand resting on my shoulder. "You've done enough," I imagined him whispering. "They see you now." Emily, though, did not dance easily. Her laughter was strained, her movement stiff, her mask slipping further with every step. She had tried to control the story, to silence me. But the truth had spoken, and it had spoken louder than she ever imagined, and the storm it unleashed would not pass quickly. After the bandleader's words and my quiet reply, the wedding was no longer the glittering fairy tale Emily had choreographed. It was something else entirely, still beautiful on the surface but fragile underneath, like glass ready to shatter with the slightest pressure. The dance floor filled slowly, guests moving with hesitation, their smiles thinner than before. Whispers never fully stopped. They rippled from table to table, glances darting my way, then back to the head table where Emily sat, her jaw locked tight, her smile painted but brittle. Michael sat beside her, but his body told a different story. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumped, his eyes distant. Every so often his gaze found me again across the room, a silent question lingering there. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did I let this happen?" I didn't answer. Not with words. I just met his gaze and gave him the same small, steady nod I had given him throughout his life. The nod that meant, "I'm here. I've always been here." As dessert was served, slices of towering cake, glistening with sugar roses, the mood grew heavier. Guests spoke in hushed tones, but their eyes told the truth. They weren't looking at Emily the way they had earlier. The awe, the admiration, it had dimmed. Instead, when they looked at me, I saw something I hadn't felt in years: respect. Not pity, not dismissal, respect. One older gentleman, a distant relative on Emily's side, leaned down as he passed my table. "Well done, ma'am," he murmured softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I didn't respond, only pressed my lips together in a faint smile. Emily noticed. She noticed every nod, every glance, every whisper. She laughed too loudly at jokes, kissed Michael's cheek for the cameras, tried to pour herself into the role of the perfect bride. But it was clear. The audience had shifted. The narrative was no longer hers to control. The photographer moved through the room, snapping pictures. When he reached my table, he hesitated, then lifted the camera. Mind if I get a shot of you, Mrs. Hart? I was taken aback, but I nodded gently. He captured me as I was, sitting in my pastel dress, pearls catching the soft light, hands folded neatly in my lap. A portrait not of extravagance, but of quiet dignity. I wondered fleetingly if one day that photo would outlast all the others. Near the end of the evening, Michael finally rose from the head table. He walked across the room with slow, deliberate steps, as though each foot carried the weight of 1,000 realizations. He reached me, bent low, and whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry." My throat tightened, but I kept my voice calm. "Enjoy your night, Michael. This is your beginning." He shook his head slightly, his eyes glassy. "It should have been yours, too." Before I could answer, Emily appeared, her smile taut, her arm snaking around his. "There you are," she said, her voice too sweet, her eyes sharp as knives. "The guests are waiting for us." Michael lingered, but Emily tugged him back. He looked over his shoulder as he walked away, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, a dawning awareness that perhaps he had been blind for too long. I remained at my table as the night wound down. Guests began to leave, offering polite goodbyes, some lingering longer at my side than at the bride's. Emily noticed every one of them, her cheeks flushed with humiliation she couldn't quite hide. When the hall finally emptied enough, I rose. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed in my chair, smoothed my dress, and lifted my purse. I didn't wait for a grand farewell. I didn't announce my departure. I simply walked toward the doors, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor. As I reached the exit, I glanced back once. Michael was standing at the head table watching me go. Emily was at his side speaking to someone, her hand clutching his arm. But he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on me. I gave him the smallest of nods, the same one I had given him at his kindergarten recital, his high school graduation, his first day at college. A nod that said, "I see you, I'm proud of you, I'm still here." And then I turned and left. The cool night air wrapped around me as I stepped outside. For the first time that day, I felt like I could breathe again. The stars glittered above, far away but steady, reminding me that not all lights fade when someone tries to dim them. That night, I went home not as the silenced mother at the back of the room, but as the woman who had finally been seen. And though Emily thought she had stolen my voice, she had only amplified it, without even realizing. The days after the wedding were strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that settles not in peace, but in aftermath. I returned to my little house, my familiar routines, the kettle whistling in the morning, the creak of the front steps, the way sunlight fell across the living room floor. But though everything looked the same, I carried a different weight inside me. For the first time in years, I hadn't been invisible, and yet the memory of Emily's whisper still lingered in my ear like smoke. "Keep quiet. We don't want old voices on the mic." It should have hurt more, and yes, it stung. But now it no longer felt like a command. It felt like proof. Proof of who she was, proof of how little she valued me. Proof that silence, when wielded with dignity, can cut deeper than any cruel word. 3 days later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Michael stood there. His suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a wrinkled shirt, his hair tousled as though he hadn't slept much. His eyes, though, were what caught me, heavy, weary, and filled with something I hadn't seen in him before. "Mom," he said softly, "can I come in?" I stepped aside, and he entered, his shoulders sagging as he sat at the kitchen table. I poured him tea the way I always had, sliding the cup toward him. He wrapped his hands around it but didn't drink. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, "Why didn't you tell me?" "About the money?" I sat across from him, folding my hands. "Because it wasn't about money, Michael. It was about you, your happiness. I didn't want to embarrass you. I didn't need credit." He rubbed, his forehead, his voice strained. But you should have had it. Everyone should have known. I shook my head. Number what they should have known, and what you should have remembered, is that I've always been here. Not in the spotlight, not for applause, but here. Always. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. I let her treat you like you didn't matter. His voice cracked. I should have defended you. Tears stung my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. You were blinded by love. I understand. But love doesn't excuse cruelty, Michael. And you need to see her for who she is now, not later, when the cost is heavier. He dropped his head into his hands, exhaling sharply. Things haven't been good since the wedding, he admitted. We fought the whole ride back from the reception. She said I embarrassed her by talking to you. She said you were trying to take attention away from her. I closed my eyes for a moment, sadness pressing against me. I had hoped even then that Emily might soften with time, but it seemed her heart was harder than I'd ever imagined. Michael lifted his head, his eyes glassy. Mom, I don't know what to do. I love her, but I can't ignore what she did to you. I reached across the table, laying my hand over his. That's your choice, Michael. Your path. But remember this. Marriage is about building, not erasing. If she cannot honor where you came from, she will never truly honor where you're going. He nodded slowly, tears glistening. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I squeezed his hand. Don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for yourself if you don't stand up now. I won't be silenced again, Michael. Not by her, not by anyone. I've given too much, sacrificed too much, to be erased at the moment I should be honored. We sat in silence for a while after that, the steam from the tea curling between us. For the first time in years, I felt like my son was looking at me not just as his mother, but as a woman, as a person whose worth could not be defined by someone else's pride. When he finally left, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. I'll fix this, he murmured into my shoulder. I didn't answer. Fixing it wasn't mine to do anymore. In the weeks that followed, whispers from the wedding spread further. Cousins called to say they had no idea I had paid. Neighbors stopped me in the market to say they admired how gracefully I had handled myself. Even distant relatives sent letters, apologizing for not realizing the role I had played. Emily, on the other hand, began to feel the shift. People weren't as quick to praise her anymore. The admiration she had soaked up so easily was replaced with questions, hesitations, coolness, where there had once been warmth. She had wanted me silent. Instead, her own silence began to cost her. And me? I carried on as I always had, teaching my Sunday school lessons, tending to my little garden, wearing my pearls not for show, but for memory. The difference now was this. I no longer felt like a shadow, because when the truth finally spoke, it spoke in my name.